Some moments don't look like beginnings at all. They arrive quietly, like a sound you almost don't notice until you realize your whole life has leaned in to listen. That's how it was the morning I first saw her, the wild bobcat, who would one day trust me enough to rest by my feet. It was late spring in northern Arizona. The orchard was still cool from the night air, rows of apple and pear trees stretching into the soft haze of dawn. I'd walked that path 1,000 times, coffee in hand, boots still damp from the irrigation line, expecting nothing more than routine. But that day, something was different. At the far fence where the wire met the woods, I heard a sound faint but sharp, like brush against metal. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbor's dogs. But when I stepped closer, I saw her. A young bobcat, small, thinner than she should have been, fur dusted with dirt and thorns tangled in a loose loop of old wire. She didn't move, didn't growl, just stared. Her eyes were the color of river stones, steady, alive, but tired in a way that only wild things know. I froze. Every instinct said, "Don't get closer." But something in the way she watched me, not pleading, not panicked, made me lower my voice and my heart beat. I spoke softly, the way I used to talk to my dog when she was nervous. "It's okay, girl. Easy now." That's all I said. But those 3 words, carried on the still air, seemed to change something between us. I didn't try to touch her. Instead, I stepped back, found an old wooden crate, and set it down about 10 feet away. On it, I left a small bowl of water and a piece of leftover chicken from the night before. Then I sat, not close, not far, just within sight. I remember the sun lifting slowly through the orchard gold, spilling over everything. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Finally, the bobcat shifted, testing the wire. With one careful twist, she pulled free. The wire clinked once against the fence post, and she was loose. She didn't run. She didn't bolt for the woods. She just stood there, still as a thought, then turned her head toward me. That was the first time I saw her full in the light. And it was the first time I felt something stir that I hadn't felt in months. See, the truth is, I hadn't expected to care about anything like that again. After my wife passed it, the orchard became a kind of half-life. I kept it going because habit is easier than healing. The days were quiet. Too quiet. The only heartbeat I could hear was my own, and even that felt muted. So when this little wild creature showed up, I didn't know what to do with the sudden noise in my chest, that strange mixture of worry, wonder, and awe. It's funny how life will send you something small and wounded, just when you've convinced yourself you have nothing left to give. The bobcat, I hadn't named her yet, took one cautious step forward, then another. She sniffed the air, her tail flicked once, and then, with a grace that seemed to belong to another world, she drank. Tiny ripples moved through the water. That was it. No drama, no sudden friendship, just a living thing deciding for one quiet moment that I wasn't a threat. And somehow, that was enough. Bobcats are solitary by nature. They keep to themselves, moving mostly at dawn and dusk, staying invisible unless hunger or danger pushes them closer to human ground. For one to linger even for a few minutes is rare. So what I saw that morning wasn't just an animal in need, it was a fragile crossing of instinct and circumstance. Experts say when wildcats look directly at you and don't flee, it's not exactly trust. It's calculation. A pause between fight and flight where curiosity wins. That pause for her was survival. For me, it became the start of something I didn't have words for yet. Later that day, I told my neighbor Nora about the encounter. She smiled that knowing desert smile people here get when they've seen too much and judged too little. "Bobcats have been here long before us," she said. "They just come out when the world gets quiet enough to feel safe again." Her words lingered. Maybe she didn't mean anything profound by them, but to me they felt like a kind of permission to let the quiet be something holy instead of lonely. That night I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, steady, unreadable, wild. I wondered where she'd go, whether she'd remember the taste of the chicken or the sound of my voice. Part of me hoped she'd never come back for her sake. The other part hoped she would. It's a strange thing how quickly our hearts will build rooms for something wild. How we'll wait for footsteps we know shouldn't come. The next morning I set out early again. Not to look for her, or at least that's what I told myself, but to check the irrigation valves near the fence. And there she was, sitting just beyond the shade line, tail wrapped neatly around her paws, watching. She didn't move when I approached. I kept my pace slow, my gaze down, not to challenge her, not to startle. I placed another small bowl of water a few feet from where I'd left it before then turned away. After a few steps, I glanced back. She was drinking again, calm as a summer morning. That simple act, her trust in the space between us, carried more grace than any sermon I'd heard in years. I realized then that kindness doesn't always need a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just the patience to sit near a fence and let another being decide when it's ready. That day the orchard felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just more alive. Every leaf, every ripple in the pond, every shift of air seemed to hum with quiet possibility. There's a kind of love that doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't reach out, doesn't claim. It just stays still long enough for another soul to feel safe. That morning, I think both of us needed that kind of love, the silent kind. She needed a place where she could drink without fear. I needed a reason to care again. We were two creatures, both a little lost, finding our footing on opposite sides of a fence. I've often thought since then about what drew her there in the first place. Maybe it was the orchard quiet green tucked against the woods like a promise. Or maybe it was just luck, the strange choreography of need and timing. But I like to believe she sensed something, that I wasn't dangerous, just lonely. And loneliness in its own way is something animals understand. When I watched her drink that morning, I felt the edges of my grief soften. Not disappear, just loosen their grip. Sometimes we think of kindness as something we give to another being. But maybe kindness is also something we allow, a space we open where life can show up unafraid. That space between her wildness and my stillness became the narrow bridge where both of us started to heal. People talk about taming wild animals, but I've learned it's the other way around. They tame our restlessness. They remind us how to listen, how to wait, how to be content with silence. Over the next few days, I kept the same quiet routine. Early mornings, slow steps, no sudden movement. She'd appear from the tree line, pause by the old fence, and watch me work. Always the same distance, maybe 10 paces between us, as if some invisible rule had been written in the dirt. That distance became its own kind of conversation. No words, no commands. Just an understanding: you stay wild, I'll stay kind. One evening I found her sitting on the crate where I used to leave food. The sky behind her was turning violet, the trees black silhouettes. She looked at me unhurried, sure, and for the first time she didn't flinch when I spoke. "Good night, Sable." The name slipped out without thought. It fit her somehow, soft, quiet, with a touch of mystery. She blinked once, slowly. Then she turned and vanished into the brush, her tail the last thing the light touched. That was how our first week ended. No farewell, no promise, just a rhythm starting to form. In the days that followed, I found myself rising earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see if she'd return, and she did. Always at dawn, always by that same stretch of fence. Little by little, the orchard and its quiet visitor became part of my morning ritual, like prayer, but without words. Each sunrise carried a question: would she come again? And if she did, would she trust me enough to stay? When was the last time you slowed down long enough to let something wild or wounded step close? Sometimes the most meaningful bonds begin not with a touch, but with the space we choose to leave open. Some mornings don't ask for words. They ask only for presence, a cup of coffee, the scent of wet earth, the quiet companionship of something wild that still remembers how to listen. That's how our days began. Not with taming, not with training, but with ritual. It started without planning. One morning turned into 2, then into a week, until I realized Sable and I had built a rhythm neither of us had spoken about. The orchard became our meeting place, the space between what was wild and what was healing. Each dawn I'd wake before the light found the valley. I'd fill my thermos, grab the same old jacket, and walk the familiar trail to the north fence. And always just as the sky began to open, I'd see her. Her shape would appear first as a whisper among the trees, a ripple in the brush. Then, as the sun stretched across the rows, she'd step out, Calm, unhurried her pause, soundless in the dew. It felt like attending a quiet service, just her, the orchard, and me. No words, no audience, only the gentle repetition of mornings that asked nothing more than to be noticed. I used to think routine was what dulled life, the sameness, the repetition. But that was before I understood that some routines restore us. They give our hearts something to measure time by, not in hours or minutes, but in grace. The orchard liturgy, that's what I came to call it in my mind. It wasn't about faith in the usual sense. It was about the simple holiness of small acts repeated with care, walking the same path, setting the same bowl of water, waiting in the same light. It made the world feel steady again. The first week was all observation. I never crossed the invisible line between us. She'd stay near the tree line, eyes sharp, tail flicking with measured calm. I'd sip my coffee, pretend to check the irrigation valves, and hum softly the same tune every morning. By the second week, she no longer hid behind the sagebrush. She'd walk along the fence as I walked the other side, almost as if we were pacing each other. Each step mirrored, each pause reflected. The third week, she began to linger. After drinking, she'd lie down near the fence post, her body angled toward me, ears relaxed. Sometimes she'd yawn, that silent, slow stretch that animals do when they feel safe enough to let their guard slip. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. I'd stay just long enough for the sunlight to hit the top leaves, then turn and head back home. Behind me, I'd hear the faint rustle of her moving deeper into the orchard, like a secret carried by the wind. Bobcats are naturally solitary. They defend their territory fiercely and rarely tolerate another adult nearby, human or otherwise. But research shows that wild animals can develop what biologists call habitual proximity tolerance. It means they learn to accept the repeated presence of a hum, one that never threatens, never chases, never disrupts. That's how trust is built in the wild, not through force, but through patterns of harmlessness. It's not kindness in the human sense, it's consistency. And consistency over time becomes its own kind of kindness. Every morning the orchard greeted me differently. Some days smelled of pear blossoms, others of dust and ripened fruit. But Sable was always there, moving with the quiet certainty of someone who belongs. Her fur caught the first light like a reflection of warmth itself. Sometimes she'd crouch low, eyes fixed on a distant sound, the kind of focus that reminds you what instinct really looks like. Other times she'd just sit, almost meditative, tail wrapped neatly around her body, watching the horizon. We never touched, we never spoke, but I swear there were mornings I could feel her calm settle into me, as if her stillness was teaching me how to breathe again. It's strange how something so simple can start to change everything around it. The orchard looked the same trees, same soil, but it began to feel alive again. When I trimmed branches or mended the fence, I found myself slowing down, paying attention to how the light shifted through the leaves, how the bees drifted from blossom to blossom. Sable had made me aware of the world again, not by doing anything extraordinary, but by simply existing near it with quiet grace. Every life needs an anchor. For some, it's faith. For others, it's family. For me, for a while, it was that small wildcat who showed up every dawn like clockwork. And through her, I started to understand something simple. Love, whether for a person, an animal, or a place, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. One morning, my neighbor Nora joined me at the fence. She'd brought her thermos, too curious about the creature I'd been talking about for weeks. We stood side by side, the air cool enough that our breath showed. Sable appeared right on time, slipping from the brush like a note from a familiar song. Nora whispered, "She trusts you. You can tell." I shook my head. Not trust, maybe tolerance. Nora smiled. That's where trust begins. Later, over coffee, she told me about a pair of bobcats that nested near her shed when her husband was sick years ago. "They don't stay for food," she said softly. "They stay for peace." That line never left me. Maybe peace has its own scent, maybe wild things can sense where it lives. I never wanted to turn Sable into something she wasn't. It's dangerous for her and for me when people try to tame what's meant to stay free. So I kept my boundaries clear. Experts remind us that wild animals depend on distance for safety. If they grow too comfortable with humans, they can lose their ability to survive or worse, wander into harm's way. So I stopped bringing food. I brought only presents. That small choice changed the tone of everything. Instead of waiting for a reward, I waited for rhythm. And rhythm gave me meaning again. One morning I arrived earlier than usual. The air was thick with fog. Every branch seemed suspended in silence. I set my coffee down on the fence post and waited. Minutes passed long enough for doubt to creep in. Maybe she wouldn't come. Maybe something had happened. Then, out of the fog, she appeared slow, deliberate, her fur beaded with dew. She walked the fence line, then stopped near me, closer than she'd ever dared before. For a long time, neither of us moved. Then she did something I'll never forget. She sat down right there between two fallen apples. Eyes half closed, body relaxed. That single gesture, her decision to rest, not run, felt like a quiet ceremony. No fanfare, no applause. Just an unspoken acknowledgement that the space between us had changed. That morning, the orchard felt like a sanctuary again. Kindness, I've learned, isn't about sudden acts of generosity. It's about showing up over and over until the world starts to trust your presence. Sable never asked for anything, but each morning she received what she needed most, a moment of calm, a place to be herself. And in return, she gave me something far greater proof that love doesn't need ownership to exist. People talk about raising animals, training them, teaching them, but sometimes the wild teaches us how to be gentle, how to be patient, how to stay rooted even when we're alone. I realized that in those quiet mornings, she wasn't the one being raised. I was. The days grew warmer. The blossoms turned to fruit, and the space between us continued to shrink quietly, almost imperceptibly. I started to wonder how far this fragile bond could go, how close she'd allow me before instinct told her to retreat. I didn't know then that the answer would come soon, not in the way I expected. Because trust once built always asks for balance. And sometimes that means letting go of what feels safe. Maybe you have your own morning ritual. A place, a moment, a quiet rhythm that steadies your day. Hold on to it, because those small repeated acts, the coffee poured, the sunrise, watched the prayer whispered, they're what tether us to life when everything else feels uncertain. Sometimes love grows heavier when your hands are full, and the only way to keep it pure is to let something go. That's the lesson the orchard began to whisper to me the summer I stopped bringing food to Sable. It was the hardest kind of kindness, the one that looks like distance. It had been almost 2 months since that first morning by the fence. 2 months of quiet routines, of shared dawns and mirrored stillness. Each day had become its own small prayer, and I thought I was doing right by her. But then came the day she stopped eating. I'd placed the usual pieces of chicken, the same careful distance, the same bowl of water, and waited. She appeared as always from the edge of the orchard, but instead of moving toward the food, she sat back on her haunches, tail flicking, eyes steady. She looked at the plate, then at me, and then for the first time she turned away. At first I thought she wasn't hungry, but the next day the same thing happened, and the day after that too. By the end of the week I realized it wasn't disinterest. It was a choice. She was telling me something in her quiet way. This is not what I need from you anymore. That understanding sank into me slowly, like cold water through soil. I'd wanted to believe our small ritual of feeding was helping her, but maybe it had become more about me, about feeling useful, connected, necessary. And now I had to face the truth. Sable didn't need saving. She needed space. There's an unspoken rule among those who live close to the land. If you truly care about something wild, you care enough to keep it wild. Feeding a wild animal might feel like compassion, but often it's the opposite. It blurs boundaries. It teaches dependency in a world where independence is survival. So that morning I made a decision. I walked to the orchard with my hands empty. No food, no offering, just stillness. I sat by the same fence post where our story began and waited, unsure what would happen next. It was quiet enough to hear the irrigation line click open across the orchard. The air smelled of dust and pear blossoms. After a few minutes, Sable appeared. She hesitated at the edge of the trees, scanning the space where I usually set the plate. Her ears twitched once, then twice. When she saw there was nothing there, she didn't leave. She walked forward, slow, cautious, and stopped just a few feet short of where I sat. For a long while, neither of us moved. The orchard seemed to hold its breath. Then she did something small but unforgettable. She sat down. Not for food, not for water, just to be. That's when I understood that what she sought wasn't my help, it was my respect. There's a strange ache that comes with doing the right thing. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like loss, a quiet, necessary loss that makes room for something truer. That morning I realized I'd been feeding her partly out of fear. Fear of losing her, fear of returning to the silence I'd known before she came. But when I stopped, that silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt sacred. Because now she wasn't there for the food. She was there by choice, and that choice meant everything. Wildlife researchers call this the threshold of trust. It's the point where an animal recognizes your presence not as a threat, but as part of the landscape, predictable, harmless, and ultimately ignorable. That's what I'd become for Sable, a fixture in her world like the fence or the windmill or the apple trees. She didn't come to me. She came near me, and in the language of the wild, that's a form of acceptance deeper than affection. We like to think that closeness is measured in inches, but in the natural world, it's measured in calm. The next day I came again with empty hands. She was already there, waiting. When I stepped through the gate, she didn't retreat this time. Her body stayed relaxed, her gaze steady. I sat in my usual place. The distance between us was maybe 12 feet, enough for comfort, enough for trust. She lay down in the grass, her ears turning toward the sounds of the orchard, the low hum of bees, the drip of water from the irrigation hose. Every so often she'd glance at me just to make sure I hadn't moved. In those glances I felt something wordless pass between us. Not gratitude, not recognition exactly, but understanding. That this was what our connection was meant to be. No more giving, no more taking, just sharing the same morning light, each in our own place. I used to think love was something you could measure by what you gave away. Time, effort, gifts, even sacrifice. But now I think real love is measured by what you're willing to withhold, by the space you leave untouched. For Sable, that space was safety. For me, it was growth. In letting her stay wild, I learned to loosen my grip on what I thought a connection should look like. And in that loosening, I found something softer than happiness, peace. One morning, I tried an experiment. Instead of sitting by the fence, I stayed a few steps farther back near the edge of the orchard, where the rows opened into sunlight. I wanted to see if she'd notice or if she'd still come. Sure enough, she did. She walked straight to her usual place, paused, then glanced around as if to find me. When she finally spotted me in the distance, she didn't come closer, but she didn't leave either. She simply stretched out under the shade as if to say, "I see you." That's enough. It struck me then maybe that's all real companionship needs, presence without possession. Later that week, I stopped by the ranger station to talk to a wildlife biologist named Tom. I told him about Sable, about the feeding, about how she'd started coming closer since I stopped. He nodded slowly. "That's how you do it, right?" he said. "You don't pull them toward you. You let them decide how close they want to be. That's how trust lasts." He told me something else I'll never forget. When a wild animal keeps returning but stays at the same distance, that's respect, not dependence. You've earned a place on her map. That phrase, "a place in her map," stayed with me. It made me think about all the times I'd tried to control outcomes in my life to keep things from leaving. Maybe everything, people, seasons. Even grief has its own migration pattern. And our job isn't to stop it, but to walk beside it for as long as it lets us. So that's what I did. From then on, I walked into the orchard with my hands empty. And somehow that absence became its own offering. It reminded me that kindness isn't about what we bring, it's about what we don't demand. It's about love that asks nothing in return except the chance to witness something beautiful, continuing to exist on its own terms. That's the kind of love that leaves a mark, but not a scar. One evening, as the sun bled low through the branches, I rose to leave. Sable was still resting under the old fence post, her breathing slow, her eyes half closed. As I stepped away, she lifted her head just slightly and watched. I stopped. For a long heartbeat, we stood in that golden half-light, the distance between us glowing like a bridge made of air. Then she blinked once, slow and deliberate, and lowered her head again. That tiny gesture, her calm acceptance of my departure, felt like the closing of a quiet chapter. She didn't need me to stay, and for the first time I didn't need to either. When I reached the porch that night, I looked down at my hands, empty, still steady. And I realized that's how healing begins, not by holding tighter, but by learning when to let go. The orchard no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a living thing again, breathing, balanced, whole. And maybe that's what she'd been teaching me all along, to live with open hands and a quiet heart. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds and light breaking through the curtains. I poured my coffee, stepped outside, and found myself smiling before I even reached the gate. Because now, every dawn carried something new. Not expectation, but wonder. And as I looked toward the orchard, I knew change was coming. You can always feel it before it arrives, like a shift in the air, a tremor in the soil. I didn't know then that Sable would soon disappear, or that she'd return with a surprise that would change everything I thought I understood about love and loyalty. If you've ever had to let something go, a person, a dream, a place, maybe you know this truth already. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is to walk in with our hands empty and still choose to stay. Trust doesn't always arrive with closeness. Sometimes it settles quietly between two lives, a shared rhythm, a breath apart, where neither needs to cross the line. That's what Sable and I learned that summer, that love can exist fully, without ever being touched. By the time July came, the orchard was heavy with fruit. The air smelled of ripeness, apples, earth heat. The mornings stretched long, and the evenings lingered soft and gold. Sable was still there, steady as sunrise, but something between us had changed. She no longer came for food or curiosity. Now she came simply to be near. Her visits followed no pattern, but somehow I always knew when she'd appear. A flicker in the corner of my vision, a hush in the orchard's hum, like the world pausing to make space for her arrival. There's a strange peace in learning someone's rhythm without ever speaking. You start to notice subtleties, how stillness has tones, how distance has meaning. For wild creatures, proximity is a language of its own. Every inch, every pause, every glance says something. A lowered head means acceptance. A sideways glance means caution. A slow blink, that's trust. Over time, I started to recognize her messages. The orchard had become our classroom, every movement a lesson in patience. I began to think of it as our distance dance. Two beings, each careful, each curious, moving through the same space without collision, bound by a quiet understanding. One afternoon, I was repairing a small leak in the irrigation line near the old tool shed. The heat shimmered across the rows. As I bent to tighten a valve, I caught sight of movement near the fence. Sable stood there watching. Not hidden, not stalking, just present. I kept working, speaking softly under my breath, as though narrating to the air. "Almost done, girl. Nothing to worry about." After a while, she walked closer, not toward me, but parallel, matching my steps as I moved down the line. Every few minutes, she'd stop our sit and watch. Her tail flicked lazily, her ears relaxed. I realized she wasn't supervising, she was sharing the afternoon. Her calm blended with the rhythm of the orchard water, trickling branches, creaking bees humming around us like background music. That's what trust looked like, not a moment of contact, but an hour of coexistence. Something was healing in that silence, two lives moving side by side, asking nothing, taking nothing. It reminded me of the quiet hours I'd once shared with my wife, sitting on the porch reading separate books, hands occasionally brushing, but words rarely needed. Presence was enough. In those afternoons with Sable, I felt that same stillness again. A calm that didn't need explanation, only participation. It struck me that maybe that's what love becomes when we grow older. Less about excitement, more about ease. Less about proving we care, more about simply being there. Wildlife biologists describe a moment like this as co-regulation. When an animal recognizes your calm energy and mirrors it, its heart rate slows, its body language softens, and its movements become rhythmic rather than reactive. It's not a submission, it's harmony. That's how animals and people communicate safety, not through words, but through consistency. For weeks, that's what we built, a language made of glances and gestures. No one leading, no one following. Just two hearts beating at a pace the orchard could understand. One late afternoon, clouds rolled in from the north. Thunder grumbled low across the valley, and a warm rain began to fall. I hurried to gather tools, tucking them under the shed roof, when I saw her standing in the open, letting the rain soak her fur. She shook once, sending a spray of droplets into the air, and looked over at me. I stayed where I was, half sheltered, half drenched. We watched each other through the curtain of rain. Every instinct said to reach out, to call, to move, to share that strange beauty. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded the smallest acknowledgement, and she blinked, slow and deliberate. Then, just as quietly as she'd appeared, she turned and disappeared into the orchard. That moment stayed with me, not for its drama, but for its restraint. It reminded me that respect sometimes sounds like silence. There's a common myth that when a wild animal doesn't fear you, it's because you've tamed it, but that isn't true. Wild animals don't love humans in the way we imagine. What they learn is that some humans can exist without threat, and that's enough. For Sable, I wasn't a savior, or even a friend in the human sense. I was simply part of her landscape, a predictable presence who didn't disrupt her world. That's what allowed her to stay. And maybe that's the higher form of love we rarely talk about, to be trusted enough to blend into the background of another being's peace. Most of us spend our lives trying to bridge gaps, to get closer, to be seen, to be understood. But Sable taught me the quiet power of leaving space. Boundaries aren't walls. They're the shape that trust takes when love matures. It's the respectful distance that says, I see you, I value you, and I won't cross what keeps you whole. Every time she lingered near me, she was teaching me that closeness doesn't always mean touching. Sometimes it means standing still, letting the moment breathe. And in that stillness, something gentle happens. You stop needing proof. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Nora stopped by with a jar of peach preserves. She found me sitting at the fence looking out over the orchard. "Still waiting on your wild friend?" she asked with a smile. I nodded. She comes when she feels like it. Never on my schedule. Nora handed me the jar and said, "That's how you know it's real, when they show up because they want to, not because they have to." I laughed softly. "You talking about cats or people?" "Both," she said, walking back toward her truck. Her words echoed long after she left. She was right about Sable and about life. The truest relationships are the ones that don't demand attendance. They bloom in freedom, not control. One morning, I decided not to go out. I stayed inside just to see what would happen. From the kitchen window, I could see the orchard still golden, waiting. At first, nothing. Then, after a few minutes, a familiar movement by the fence. Sable stepped into the clearing, looked toward the house, and sat down right where I usually did. She stayed there for a while, then walked the orchard path alone. It felt like she was reminding me that our ritual wasn't mine to control. She didn't need me there every day, only the knowledge that I would be there somewhere in the same world. That quiet independence, that balance, was the purest form of trust I'd ever witnessed. That summer, the orchard became a place of still companionship. We existed side by side, but not intertwined, separate, yet somehow connected. In her distance, I saw my own healing mirrored back to me. The grief I once carried began to loosen its grip. I realized I didn't need to fill every silence. Some silences are sacred. Every morning spent near her felt like a reminder that life doesn't always need fixing. Sometimes it just needs witnessing. As August turned to September, the days began to cool. The orchard started to fade into autumn colors, and Sable's visits became less frequent. I didn't worry. I'd learned enough by then to understand that the wild moves in cycles here, gone back again. But I still felt it, that faint, familiar ache when she wasn't there. The ache that comes when beauty becomes memory. I didn't know it yet, but her absence would soon stretch longer than ever before. And when she finally returned, she wouldn't be alone. If you've ever shared quiet time with someone, human or animal, where no words were needed, you know this truth. Trust doesn't always live in closeness. Sometimes it lives in the space you choose to leave untouched. Some stories don't end, they just go quiet for a while. Sometimes what disappears isn't gone at all. It's just teaching you how to wait. That's what the orchard became that autumn, a lesson in waiting and in love that holds its breath. September came with its gentle, unraveling green turning to gold, heat softening into cool wind. The orchard began to slow down, and so did she. For weeks, Sable's visits grew shorter, less predictable. At first, I told myself it was the weather, or the harvest season, or the restlessness that comes with wild blood. But deep down, I knew what was happening. She was pulling away. I tried not to take it personally. Animals move with the seasons. They vanish because they must. But knowing that didn't make the silence any easier to carry. We don't often talk about how absence has a sound. It isn't quiet, not really. It's full of small noises, the creak of the gate left unopened, the way your footsteps echo when there's no one waiting. After months of her presence, the orchard felt different too, still too symmetrical, too human. Her wildness had become part of its heartbeat. Every morning I still walked out with my coffee, still paused by the same fence post, still waited. Nothing moved but the wind. Absence, I learned, isn't emptiness. It's the echo of connection, what remains when presence steps away. It was the first truly cold morning of the year. A faint frost had gathered along the edges of the orchard fence. I remember standing there watching my breath rise like smoke. For months, I'd been able to sense her before she appeared, a shift in the air, a subtle weight in the silence. That day, there was nothing. I waited longer than usual. Long enough for the sun to climb over the trees, long enough for the coffee to go cold in my hands. Still nothing. It shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. You get used to miracles, even small ones, and when they stop showing up, the world feels slightly tilted. Loss doesn't always arrive with a door slammed shut or a final goodbye. Sometimes it just fades like the last glow of daylight slipping behind the hills. I'd known people who vanished suddenly. Grief that came all at once, sharp and loud. But this was different. This was a soft kind of vanishing one that leaves you half hoping, half knowing. Each morning I walked the orchard path, as if retracing a memory that might step out and meet me again. I'd pause by her spot near the fence, half expecting to see the sway of brush, the glint of fur. But the only movement was wind through dry leaves, the kind of motion that fools your heart for a second before reminding you it's just wind. And yet even in her absence, I still felt her here. It's strange how something wild can carve a space in you that keeps living long after it's gone. Wildlife biologists often remind us, animals aren't loyal to us, they're loyal to the rhythms of the earth. Bobcats especially move within large territories. When food grows scarce or breeding season begins, they travel sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. What we see as disappearance is often just migration. They follow the pulse of nature, not the comfort of familiarity. And maybe that's a truth that applies to more than animals. Maybe people do that too. Leave for a while, not out of rejection, but because something in them needs to move, to change, to grow. The orchard changed with her absence. Without her movement, everything felt more fragile, more exposed. I noticed small details I'd overlooked before, the way the dew froze around fallen fruit, how the early light cut long shadows through the rows. Some mornings, I'd catch myself talking aloud, little murmurs of habit. "Morning, girl." I'd whisper to the wind, half embarrassed, half comforted by the sound of my own voice. I started writing small notes in a weathered notebook I kept in the barn, sketches of where I'd seen her last tracks I thought were hers, scraps of reflection that always ended with the same line, "Still waiting." It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about holding on to something pure, a reminder that patience can be its own act of love. One afternoon, Nora stopped by to drop off a basket of late peaches. When she saw the empty orchard, she asked, "Haven't seen your cat lately?" I smiled a little. "Not for weeks now. She's probably moved on." Nora nodded. "They always do. But sometimes they circle back when the time's right." She told me about her own years waiting for the hawks to return each spring. "They always leave," she said. "But when they come back even once, it makes every empty day worth it." That night I sat on the porch and thought about that, how faith isn't loud and waiting isn't weakness. It's a kind of quiet loyalty. Ecologists talk about ecosystems as if they're systems of balance, things coming and going, always in motion. But what they don't often say is how emotional that balance feels when you're part of it. When something wild enters your life, even briefly, you stop being an observer. You become a participant in rhythm, in loss, in wonder. So when absence comes, it doesn't erase what was. It deepens it. The empty orchard became my teacher again. It reminded me that love, at its truest, doesn't end when presence fades. It continues quietly in memory, in gratitude, in the hope of return. I began to understand that waiting isn't a pause in life, it's part of the rhythm. It's an act of faith. Every morning I still made the walk, not because I expected her, but because the act itself kept something alive in me. The orchard had become my companion. The sound of wind in the leaves, the creak of the gate, the hum of bees, all reminders that life keeps moving, even when you don't see it. Sometimes I think waiting is how we learn to listen again. When there's nothing to look at, your eyes open inward. You start noticing the small kindnesses of the world, the ones that never stopped, even when you were too distracted to see them. That's what the season of absence gave me: clarity. A slower heart, a quieter kind of gratitude. One frosty morning in late November, I walked the orchard after a light snow. The air was still, the ground pale and untouched. Then, near the far fence line, I saw them, small prints, delicate but distinct. Bobcat tracks. I followed them a few paces before they vanished into the woods. She hadn't come close, hadn't lingered, but she'd passed through. And in that moment, I didn't need more proof. Just the knowledge that she was still out there, living, surviving, thriving in her own quiet world. Sometimes love doesn't need reunion. It only needs reassurance. There's a kind of loyalty that doesn't chase. It simply stands still, trusting the bond beneath the surface. That's how I loved Sable, not by holding on, but by keeping faith in her return, however distant it might be. The orchard felt different that winter, bare, skeletal, but honest. In its emptiness, I could see everything clearly. The way loss refines love, and waiting refines the soul. Absence wasn't punishment. It was proof that something once beautiful had been real. As the days shortened and frost thickened, I began to notice small signs of change, faint rustling at the orchard edge. A shadow where there hadn't been one before. Maybe it was wishful thinking, or maybe, like the seasons, everything returns when it's time. Because one morning, weeks later, I'd step outside and find not just Sable again, but something new beside her. Something that would turn the quiet ache of waiting into wonder all over again. If you've ever waited for something you weren't sure would return, a person, a season, a small flicker of hope, hold on to that patience. Because waiting, when it's done with love, isn't emptiness, it's faith in motion. Sometimes what you lose doesn't come back the same. Sometimes it returns, carrying the next chapter in its paws. That's what happened the morning I saw Sable again and realized she hadn't just survived the winter. She'd brought new life with her. It was late March, the kind of morning that smells like thawed earth and apple buds. The orchard was stirring, awake, soft light sliding between bare branches. I had stopped expecting her. The waiting had turned into quiet remembering, a comfort rather than a longing. Then, as I bent to check the irrigation gate, I felt that old pull, the sudden stillness of the air, the hush that comes before recognition. When I looked up, she was there. Sable. Her fur looked thicker now, a deeper bronze brushed with silver. And just behind her, half hidden by a tangle of grass, was a smaller shape. A kit. It moved with clumsy grace, all wide eyes and oversized paws. Sable turned once as if to make sure I saw, then stepped forward. That was the first time I ever saw her not alone. In the wild, every season writes its own continuation. When a creature returns after a long absence, it's rarely a chance. It's part of the unbroken thread of instinct and trust. Bobcats are solitary, yet mothers are fiercely devoted. They keep their young hidden until the kit is strong enough to follow, until the world feels safe again. So the fact that she brought her kit here to this orchard to me meant something beyond comprehension. It wasn't ownership or dependence. It was a memory. Wild animals remember safety the way we remember kindness, not by faces, but by feeling. And she had remembered this place as gentle ground. The kit stumbled forward, curious, its head turning toward the glint of my coffee mug. I stayed perfectly still, kneeling beside the fence post. Sable's gaze followed every movement, calm, alert, ready. When the kit pawed at a fallen apple, she let it explore, only flicking her tail when it wandered too close. At one point it looked straight at me, those round, curious eyes, and then back at her, as if asking permission. Sable didn't move. That stillness was all the permission I needed. So I lowered my head slightly, acknowledging them both, and whispered, "Welcome back." They stayed a while, the kit rolling in the grass, Sable watching the orchard wrapped in a hush so full it almost felt sacred. Then, as the sun lifted higher, they slipped away into the trees. But something in me stayed glowing long after they'd gone. Some moments split your life into before and after moments that rewrite quiet sadness into quiet joy. Seeing her again alive and with her young was like seeing proof of hope made real. It felt as if the orchard had exhaled after holding its breath all winter. I realized then that what I thought was an ending, her vanishing, had only been a pause. Life had kept moving just out of sight, building something worth returning with. It reminded me how healing often happens the same way, unseen, slow, and miraculous. Wildlife experts say that when a bobcat mother brings her kit near human scent, it means profound trust in the environment. She wouldn't risk exposure unless she felt the place held no threat. Mothers teach by modeling, by showing their young where safety lives, where food can be found, where the world is kind. In her own way, Sable was doing just that. Not introducing her kit to me, but to peace. And maybe that's the finest inheritance any mother can give, not protection from the world, but confidence in it. They began coming often. Some mornings I'd find the kit wrestling with fallen pears while Sable watched from the shadows. Other days she'd leave it behind for a while, teaching independence, disappearing into the brush, and returning with the steady patience of a teacher. I started keeping a respectful distance camera slung over my shoulder, but rarely used. Some things are better remembered by heart. Once during a gentle rain, the kit darted toward my boots, too young to know fear. Sable's head snapped up, muscles tense. I froze. Then she relaxed, and the kit stopped inches away, sniffing the air before scampering back to her side. That brief moment, curiosity meeting caution, summed up everything I loved about them. It was a tiny dance between wonder and wisdom. Watching them together taught me something I hadn't learned in all my years of caring for this land. Kindness doesn't end where it's given. It echoes. The care I'd shown months ago, the patience, the boundaries, the stillness had rippled forward into this moment. The trust between us had stretched far enough to include another life. And isn't that how love works in every form? When we act with gentleness, even once we never really know where that gentleness will travel. It may return, someday changed, multiplied, carrying a small miracle in its arms. A local ranger stopped by one afternoon to check the orchard permits. I mentioned the bobcats, careful not to say too much. He smiled knowingly. If she's brought a kit, you've done something right. She trusts your space. Just keep your distance, let her teach it how to live wild. He looked over the rows of budding trees and added, "Most people think coexistence means getting close. It doesn't. It means staying respectful and still being allowed to witness." That word witness stayed with me. It felt exactly right. I wasn't raising her. I was witnessing her story, grateful to have a small seat at its edge. Spring in the desert foothills brings a fragile balance, predators guiding their young through abundance and risk. For the first few months, a bobcat mother moves her den, often teaching awareness through change. I watched Sable do that, always cautious, always measured. Sometimes I'd see them at dawn, other times not for days. But the rhythm was steady: appear, teach, disappear, return. In that rhythm, I saw something human. The way parents, friends, even life itself teaches us to let go again and again, until we learn to trust return over possession. One bright morning, the kit tumbled through the orchard, chasing a butterfly pause skidding on the soft soil. Sable followed slowly, eyes half-lidded, amused, but vigilant. When the butterfly vanished, the kit turned toward me as if to share its surprise. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw pure joy, the kind that belongs entirely to the present. It made me laugh quietly, the sound surprising even me. Sable's ears twitched, then relaxed again. She'd accepted my laughter as part of the orchard's song. That small permission to share delight without crossing a line felt like the closest we'd ever come to true communion. That season taught me that love doesn't always leave and return unchanged. Sometimes it comes back carrying proof that it survived, that it grew while you weren't looking. Seeing Sable again with her kit by her side was like being handed back all the hope I'd once let go of. The orchard, once bare and hollow, now brimmed with motion and meaning. Every rustle in the grass felt like gratitude, and I realized something simple yet profound. The wild doesn't owe us its presence. When it returns, it's a gift, one that humbles more than it heals. As the days lengthened, their visits became a kind of ritual again. But this time I knew better. I didn't follow. I didn't try to call them closer. I understood now that the best way to honor trust is to keep it sacred. By midsummer, they'd begun venturing farther into the hills, and I knew soon Sable would leave for good once her kit was grown enough to walk its own path. Before that happened, I wanted to leave something behind, not food, not comfort, but safety. A sign that this place would always remain kind. That choice to protect without possession would become the foundation of what came next. When something or someone you love returns after time apart, take a moment to see what's changed in them and in you. Often what comes back carries the proof that kindness leaves traces long after we think it's gone. The closer we grow to what's wild, the more we're reminded love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's ownership. And ownership is what the wild was never meant to bear. That's what the orchard taught me that last summer with Sable, that respect is the highest form of affection. By July, the fruit had ripened heavily on the trees. The air shimmered with heat, and the orchard carried the tired sweetness of a long season nearly spent. Sable and her kit still visited, but less often. Some mornings I'd catch only a glimpse, a flicker of tawny fur between the rows or paw prints in the soft earth near the fence. They were growing more distant as nature intended. And for the first time, I didn't feel that ache. I felt something quieter, acceptance. There's a point in every bond, whether with a person, an animal, or even a place where care becomes a test. You have to decide, will you hold tighter, or will you step back and let it breathe? In the wild, boundaries are everything. They protect survival, ensure balance, and prevent trust from turning into harm. I'd learned this lesson slowly. At first, I thought closeness was progress, that the smaller the distance, the stronger the bond. But as the seasons turned, I began to understand the truth. The wild doesn't measure love in inches, it measures it in respect. That realization changed everything, how I acted, how I filmed, how I lived within this shared space. One morning I noticed Sable's kit near the irrigation ditch, crouched low and watching a butterfly dance over the grass. I lifted my camera, not to post, not to prove, but to remember. When the lens focused, I could see the tiny muscles twitching beneath its fur, every instinct alive and alert. I wanted to step closer for a clearer shot, but I didn't. Something in me knew that the photograph would cost too much, not in danger, but in trust. So I lowered the camera. I watched through the blur of my own nearsighted eyes, instead a softer picture, but a truer one. That was the first time I realized boundaries aren't fences. They're gifts we give to what we love so it can stay whole. We live in a world that tells us closeness is proof of connection, that to show love we must touch, claim, and capture. But nature asks for the opposite. It asks us to let beauty remain free, even if that means never getting as close as we'd like. That day, standing in the sunlight, I felt a strange peace wash over me. Because for the first time, I didn't want Sable or her kit to need me anymore. I wanted them to remember safety here and to keep moving forward. It reminded me of something my wife once said before she passed. Love isn't about keeping, it's about seeing. I didn't understand it then. Now I did. Biologists call it habituation when animals grow too used to human presence. It can lead them to approach roads, camps, or neighborhoods, often with tragic results. So responsible wildlife watchers follow a few simple rules. Keep a distance, avoid feeding, observe quietly. Leave no scent, no noise, no mark that changes behavior. Those boundaries are a form of kindness, invisible but vital. They teach both sides how to coexist without harm. Sable had taught me that. And in her teaching, I found a code I'd follow long after she was gone. That fall, I began to make small changes around the orchard. I cleared the fence line, removing old wire that could trap a paw. I set up 2 motion cameras, not for vanity, but to record movement safely without me being there. I even placed a small bell on the far post, not to scare, but to signal when someone entered the space, human or animal. Each act felt like drawing a line between presence and protection. I was no longer trying to be part of the wild. I was learning how to stand beside it. When I watched the night footage later, a bobcat's shadow slipping through silver moonlight tail curved like smoke, I felt proud. Not because she'd come back, but because she could. Freely. We often use words like taming, saving, or raising when we talk about animals. But the truth is, the wild doesn't need saving from itself. It needs saving from us. The best kind of coexistence isn't about bringing the wild closer. It's about learning to live in parallel, each honoring the other's boundaries. When we give space, we give survival. When we step back, we allow the world to breathe. And maybe that's a lesson our human relationships need too, to love without turning love into ownership. Later that month, the local ranger Tom invited me to a small town hall event on coexistence with wildlife. I brought a few clips from the orchard, short quiet moments, Sable walking at dawn, the kit chasing shadows. When the lights dimmed and the footage played, no one spoke. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't staged. It was just life, unedited, honest, respectful. Afterward, a woman came up and said, "It's peaceful. You didn't try to make it yours." That to me was the highest compliment. Because in every frame I wanted the wild to speak for itself, not through my narration, but through stillness. That night, driving home under a half moon, I realized this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone willing to listen quietly. There's a word I once heard a wildlife teacher use, reciprocity. It means mutual exchange, both sides giving something of equal weight. I gave patience and the orchard gave me peace. Sable gave trust and I gave space. That's balance. That's the quiet contract between humanity and nature, one written without ink, signed in silence. And if you honor it long enough, it starts to change how you move through the world. You walk more slowly, speak softer, notice more. That's how coexistence begins, not with rules, but with reverence. One evening in late August, the air heavy with the scent of ripe fruit, I saw them one last time. Sable walked along the orchard's edge, her kit nearly her size, now sleek and sure-footed. They paused at the fence, both turning to look back, not at me, but at the place itself. For a heartbeat, it felt like goodbye. Not sorrowful, just inevitable. The kind of farewell you give when the lesson's been learned. They slipped into the brush shadows, folding into the dusk. And that was enough. The orchard felt full even as it emptied, because what they left behind was invisible respect, serenity, a trace of shared belonging. As I stood there, evening light soft against the fields, I thought about all the boundaries that had shaped my life, the ones I broke, the ones I ignored, and the ones that saved me. Sable's gift wasn't her presence. It was her absence, teaching me to see that love grows strongest where freedom still breathes. Every creature deserves the dignity of its own wildness. And every person needs to remember that love at its core is permission. By autumn's end, the orchard had gone quiet again. Leaves fell, bare branches reached into the sky, and I found peace in the rhythm of endings. I still checked the fence line every morning. Not expecting to see her, but grateful to remember her. Because what had begun as a chance encounter had become something much larger, a reflection of life itself. Seasons, connection, loss, return, respect. And soon winter would bring the final scene, the first frost, and a simple sign that the story was never truly over. If you've ever loved something wild, a person, a dream, a memory, let it breathe. Give it room to move, to grow, to return on its own. Because when love learns to respect boundaries, it becomes what it was always meant to be. A kindness that lasts. Sometimes endings don't arrive with goodbyes. They arrive with stillness, a silence that feels full instead of empty. That was the orchard that winter. No footsteps, no movement, just frost painting the ground where a wild friendship had once bloomed. The first frost came early that year. The air smelled of cedar and wood smoke. I woke before dawn and stepped outside, the world hushed beneath a thin sheet of silver. The orchard looked suspended in time, every branch etched in ice, every blade of grass tipped with light. My breath rose like mist, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. I walked the familiar path, boots crunching softly over frozen soil. It had been weeks since I'd last seen Sable. The orchard had grown used to her absence, but my heart still looked for signs. Paw prints, broken stems, a shadow that didn't belong to wind. That morning, something felt different. At the far end of the orchard, by the old fence post, the snow looked disturbed. I knelt, and there they were, 2 sets of tracks side by side. One large, one small, the mother and her grown kit. The prints were fresh pressed deep into the frost. They led from the woods, crossed the orchard, and disappeared near the old shed where she'd once watched me work. I stood there a long time, my hands in my pockets, the cold biting but bearable. I didn't need to see her to know she'd been here. Presence doesn't always require sight. Sometimes it's enough to feel the echo, the assurance that something wild still moves through your world. Nature has its own language for love. It doesn't promise permanence. It promises continuation. When a creature returns to the place it once trusted, even silently, even briefly, it's a kind of grace. That morning I understood that Sable hadn't vanished from my life. She'd folded into it the way seasons do. Our story hadn't ended. It had matured into something quieter, something that could exist without constant proof. I used to think closure meant finality. But standing there watching sunlight spill over the frost, I realized closure is just another word for peace. I followed the trail halfway across the orchard, careful not to disturb the prints. Near the base of one tree, I found something half buried in snow, a feather caught in ice. Maybe it had fallen from a passing bird, maybe not. But in that moment, it felt like a sign, a simple offering from the land itself. I picked it up and brushed off the frost. The feather was brown and soft, the tip white like winter's signature. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder. Everything that touches us leaves something behind. Even what's wild. That's what Sable had given me. Not ownership, not companionship in the usual sense, but perspective. She'd taught me that kindness, patience, and love could exist without words or promises. They could exist purely as presence, shared space, shared breath. As I stood there, I thought about the man I'd been before she came, restless, lonely, stuck between memory and routine. And the man I'd become after, slower, gentler, more willing to let the world be what it is. Healing doesn't always roar into your life. Sometimes it walks on quiet paws, teaches you to wait, and then disappears, leaving only peace behind. Sable had been a teacher I didn't ask for, but desperately needed. Through her, I learned that every bond has its season. Some are brief and bright, others long and patient, but all of them, if we honor them, become part of who we are. That winter, the orchard didn't feel empty. It felt whole, because I could finally see it as she must have, alive, unpossessed enough, just as it was. Bobcats give birth in early spring, raise their young through summer, and part ways as autumn fades. It's nature's rhythm of independence, not abandonment, but evolution. The kit learns to hunt to survive, to live without its mother's watchful eye. That's how survival works in the wild, through gradual separation. And maybe it's how survival works in the human heart too. When I saw those tracks, mother and kit, side by side, then diverging into the woods, I felt no sadness, only gratitude. They were doing what they were meant to do, move forward. And so was I. Over time, I came to see that the orchard had never just been a place. It was a mirror. It reflected my own life, the loss, the waiting, the return, and the letting go. Each season had offered a quiet lesson. Spring showed me curiosity. Summer taught me connection. Autumn revealed patience. And winter, this first frost, taught me reverence. There's a holiness in things we can't keep, the kind that humbles us, reminding us we were only ever visitors here. The orchard didn't belong to me. Sable didn't belong to me. And yet, in respecting that truth, I found belonging of my own, the kind rooted not in possession, but in harmony. Even after that day, I kept walking through the orchard each morning. I'd trace the same path, pause by the fence, and let the cold air sting my face awake. Sometimes I'd spot new prints, coyote, rabbit, quail. The world was still moving, still writing its stories in the snow. And though I never saw Sable again, I always whispered a small greeting under my breath. "Good morning, girl, wherever you are." It wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. A quiet prayer of thanks for what had been and for the reminder that love in its truest form never asks to be held. It only asks to be honored. Over the years, I've come to believe that the line between us and the wild isn't as wide as we think. We're all looking for the same things. Safety, understanding a place that lets us be ourselves. Sable found it in the orchard. I found it in her presence. Maybe that's the secret, that the wild doesn't just live out there in the woods. It lives inside us too, waiting for stillness, for trust, for a soft kind of love that expects nothing back. And when we finally learn to see it in others, in nature, in ourselves, the world stops feeling separate. It feels connected again. That winter, I shared some of Sable's story with a local wildlife center. They used the footage and notes to educate visitors about bobcats, their behavior, their resilience, their need for space. It felt right to turn something personal into something protective. Because stories like this aren't just about one person and one animal. They're reminders of how fragile coexistence can be and how powerful compassion becomes when paired with respect. When you protect the wild, you protect the part of yourself that still believes in wonder. The last morning before spring, I found the feather again, the one I'd pocketed months before. I'd forgotten about it. It had bent slightly worn from time, but it still carried that same softness, that same quiet dignity. I placed it on the fence post where I'd first met Sable. The wood was cold, frosted white, and the feather trembled slightly in the breeze before settling. It felt like the end of a prayer, the kind that doesn't ask for anything, only offers thanks. That's the quiet gift of all this, to see beauty, to hold it gently, and to let it return to the wind. Maybe you've had your own Sable, a wild presence that entered your life and changed it in ways you didn't expect. Maybe it wasn't an animal. Maybe it was a person, a place, or a season that taught you how to love without needing to hold. If this story touched something in you, take a moment today to step outside. Breathe the cold air. Watch the light shift. And remember that gentleness is its own kind of strength. If you'd like to hear more stories of kindness, love, loyalty, and the soulful connection between people and wild creatures, please like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel share stories that remind us we still belong to something beautiful. And if you'd like to go one step further to help rescue and heal wild animals like Sable, the bobcat who taught me to listen, you can click the Super Thanks button or donate through the link below. Every gesture, every dollar, every bit of kindness makes a difference. Because the wild doesn't just need protection, it needs people who care enough to keep its stories alive.